The cavern was hidden beneath a jagged expanse of rock, far from any known path or village, its entrance concealed by time and earth. Within its depths, an ancient tree grew, its gnarled roots weaving through the stone like the veins of some colossal beast. The tree's branches reached upwards, holding leaves that emitted a ghostly, bluish glow, bathing the entire cavern in an eerie light. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of ancient power. This was the Forbidden Tree, the source of a legend so old that even those who whispered of it spoke only in half-forgotten tales and fragmented prayers. Some said it was the very tree from the Garden of Eden, cursed and exiled to the depths of the earth to keep its dark fruit from the reach of mortal hands. Others claimed it held within its roots the remnants of a world lost to sin and shadow. But the tree's true secret lay not in its roots or its fruit, but in what it held prisoner. Chained to its trunk was a figure, her form shrouded in darkness and forgotten by the world above. Her name was Lilith, and she had once been the harbinger of mankind's greatest fears. Long ago, ancient forces had bound her to this place, fearing what she might unleash upon the world. Her beauty was otherworldly, almost celestial, and yet there was something deeply unsettling about her. Something in the way her pale skin seemed to absorb the tree's blue light, and how her eyes held the promise of forbidden things. Her wrists were bound by chains crafted not of iron, but of something far older and far more sacred. The bones of fallen angels. The links were etched with runes so ancient that their meanings had been lost to time, runes that whispered of sorrow and betrayal. These chains were not forged by mortal hands, but by those who had once stood beside the Creator himself, before their pride had cast them into the abyss. The bones were smooth and ivory white, glowing faintly with the remnants of divine power, even in their desecrated state. They were unyielding, unbreakable. At least, they had been. Lilith's eyes, a shade of deep onyx, stared out into the darkness, unblinking. Her voice was a whisper, a murmur that seemed to rise and fall like a distant wind, its echoes almost imperceptible. Her words held no malice, only longing. A longing to be free of this ancient prison, to feel the world beyond these cavern walls, to unleash her truth upon it once more. Yet beneath that yearning was something else, a hunger that had never been sated and a rage that had never truly faded. It was said that Lilith had been the first to defy the Creator's will, the first to seek power beyond what was given. For that, she had been cast out, made a pariah, and a legend whispered in fear. She had lured kings to ruin, driven men to madness, and corrupted those who dared listen to her voice. In the end, those who sought to protect the world from her had chained her here, to the very tree whose fruit she once craved. Now, Lilith was but a memory to most, a cautionary tale of what lay in the dark corners of the world. But time had a way of eroding even the strongest chains, and the ancient bones that held her were not immune to its passage. The dry wind swept across the barren hills, carrying with it the scent of dust and the faint bray of restless sheep. Omar wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting against the sun's harsh light. He was a man of 50 years, his skin leathery and weathered from a lifetime beneath the unrelenting sun. His eyes, once bright and full of warmth, were now tired, heavy with a sadness he had carried for many years. It was a grief he kept hidden from his sons, Halim and Yusuf, but one that never truly left him. The herd was small, barely enough to sustain them, yet enough to keep them moving across these rocky hills, searching for patches of stubborn grass or trickles of water in this unforgiving land. They had taken shelter earlier that day beneath a lone acacia tree, resting until the heat began to wane. But the brief respite had come with a cost. One of their sheep had wandered off. "Halim," Omar called, his voice carrying a hint of annoyance. "Did you not tie that one down?" Halim, barely 17, was a slender boy with a wild head of black curls and a smile that, often appeared at the most inconvenient of times. He was the dreamer among them, always curious, always pushing boundaries that were meant to keep them safe. Halim's eyes widened in apology as he scrambled to his feet, dusting off his worn trousers. "I thought I did, Baba," Halim muttered, his voice tinged with guilt. He grabbed his shepherd's staff, ready to search for the lost sheep. "You thought?" Yousef's voice cut in sharply. He was Halim's elder by 3 years and carried himself with a seriousness that belied his youth. Yousef was the responsible one, always focused on what needed to be done, what needed to be controlled. He often found himself acting as both a brother and a guide to Halim. Today was no different. "Enough," Omar said, raising a hand. He was too tired for their bickering. "We'll all look for it. Spread out. The storm clouds are gathering, and we don't want to be caught out in the open." The 3 of them began their search, each moving in a different direction. Omar felt the first stirrings of unease as he glanced at the darkening sky. Storms were rare but not unheard of in this region, and when they came swiftly. He muttered a silent prayer under his breath, asking for guidance. The hills were silent save for the wind and the occasional bleat from the herd. Omar's thoughts drifted, as they often did, to memories of his lost daughter. It had been nearly 5 years since the conflict that took her from him. A clash between rival tribes that had swept through their village like a wildfire. His daughter's death had left a void in his heart that no amount of time or faith could fill. "Baba, over here!" Halim's voice rang out, echoing against the rocks. Omar turned and saw Halim waving, standing at the entrance to a narrow gorge. Omar hurried over, with Yousef following close behind. "Did you find it?" Yousef asked, glancing around. "No, but I found something else," Halim said, his voice laced with excitement. He pointed toward the gorge, where a faint blue glow emanated from deep within. Omar's brow furrowed as he looked into the darkness. The bluish light was unnatural, shimmering like the reflection of moonlight on still water. He felt a shiver run down his spine, an old instinct warning him of danger. The stories of their ancestors were full of tales of hidden places and cursed caverns, places where only fools or the desperate dared to venture. "We should leave," Omar said firmly. "The sheep isn't here, and that light." "Baba, what if the sheep wandered in there?" Halim interrupted, his curiosity getting the better of him. "We can't just leave it. And besides, don't you want to know what's in there?" "It's not our place to know," Omar replied, his voice strained. "We have no business in dark places." Yousef, ever practical, hesitated but nodded in agreement with his father. "Baba's right. There's no telling what's inside." But Halim's excitement was difficult to quell. "Just a quick look," he urged. "We've never seen anything like this. Maybe it's a sign." "There are no signs in dark places, Halim," Omar snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Only shadows." Yet, even as he said the words, Omar felt the pull of that bluish light, a strange allure that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had spent a lifetime teaching his sons to be cautious, to respect the unseen dangers of the world. But he also knew that curiosity was a powerful force, especially in the heart of a restless youth. Halim took a cautious step toward the gorge. Omar wanted to stop him, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the desperation to keep his sons from following the same path of grief and regret that he had walked for so long. He sighed heavily, relenting to the inevitable. "Stay close," Omar warned. "And do not touch anything." The 3 of them entered the gorge, moving slowly toward the source of the light. The walls closed in around them, and the air grew cooler and thicker. The bluish glow became brighter, casting long shadows that danced on the rocky walls. Halim led the way, his eyes wide with wonder, while Yousef stayed close to Omar, watching their surroundings warily. After what felt like an eternity, the narrow passage opened into a vast cavern. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had ever seen. In the center of the cavern stood a massive, twisted tree, its roots spreading out like the tendrils of some ancient creature. The leaves of the tree glowed with a soft, ethereal blue light, illuminating the entire cavern in an otherworldly glow. And beneath the tree, chained to its trunk, was a woman. Omar's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure. She was beautiful, in a way that defied description. Her skin was pale and luminous, her hair flowing like rivers of shadow. But it was her eyes that held him captive. Eyes as dark and endless as the night, filled with both sadness and something else, something deeper and more unsettling. Who is that?" Yousef whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman stirred, her chains clinking softly as she lifted her head to look at them. The chains themselves were unlike any Omar had ever seen. Crafted from bones, smooth and white as ivory, each link engraved with ancient runes that seemed to pulse with a faint light of their own. Omar felt a chill run through him as the woman's gaze met his. There was something ancient in her eyes, something that spoke of forgotten things and broken oaths. "Travelers," she said, her voice soft and melodic, like the rustling of leaves in a quiet forest. "Have you come to free me?" Omar opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He could feel his son's eyes on him, waiting for him to decide what to do. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to take his sons and flee this place. But that voice, that light, there was something so alluring, so familiar about it. "Who are you?" Halim asked, his voice trembling with both fear and excitement. The woman smiled, a sad and knowing smile that seemed to reach into the depths of Omar's soul. "I am forgotten," she said, "but if you free me, I will be remembered again, and I will grant you all that you desire." Omar felt his heart begin to pound in his chest, and he knew that he was standing on the edge of something terrible. Yet, despite the fear, he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. The bluish glow of the tree cast long, eerie shadows across the cavern, and Omar couldn't help but feel as if those shadows were watching them, waiting for something, waiting for them to make a choice. The cavern was silent, save for the faint rustling of the tree's glowing leaves. Omar stood frozen, unable to pull his gaze away from the woman chained to the ancient tree. His heart was pounding, his instincts screaming for him to leave this cursed place. But the allure of the woman's voice held him captive. Halim took a cautious step forward, his eyes wide with wonder and curiosity. Omar's hand shot out to grab his son's arm, his fingers trembling slightly. "Stay back," he warned, his voice strained. "But Baba," Halim protested, his voice barely above a whisper, "she's chained. She can't harm us." "Do not assume what you do not know," Omar replied, his voice harsher than he intended. His gaze flickered to Yousef, who was standing a few steps behind, his face pale and his brow furrowed in confusion. Omar could see the fear in his eldest son's eyes, but there was something else there, too. Something that mirrored the curiosity in Halim's gaze. "Who are you?" Halim repeated, his voice wavering slightly. The woman tilted her head, studying them with an almost childlike curiosity. Her dark eyes gleamed in the bluish light, and Omar felt a shiver run down his spine as her gaze moved from Halim to Yousef and finally to him. When she spoke again, her voice was soft and melodic, carrying with it an air of ancient sorrow. "I have had many names," she said, her voice echoing faintly in the cavern. "In times long past, I was known as Lilith." Omar's breath caught in his throat. The name was familiar, spoken only in hushed tones by the elders of their village, whispered in prayers meant to ward off evil spirits. Lilith was a figure from the old tales, a creature of darkness and deceit, said to have been cast out by the divine for her defiance. "It cannot be," Omar muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if trying to clear away the fog of disbelief. "You are a legend, a story meant to frighten children." Lilith's smile was sad and knowing. "Legends are merely truths long forgotten," she replied. "And stories, Stories have power, even when their origins are lost to time. Yousef, who had been silent until now, took a hesitant step forward. His eyes were fixed on the tree's glowing fruit, its light casting an ethereal halo around each pearlescent orb. "Why are you chained here?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Lilith's eyes softened, and Omar felt an unsettling warmth in his chest, as if her gaze had reached inside him and touched something he had long buried. "I was imprisoned by those who feared me," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "They believed I held too much power that could shape the world in ways they could not control. So they bound me here, to this tree, with chains forged from the bones of those who once stood beside the Creator himself." Halim's eyes widened in awe as he stared at the ivory-white chains that bound her wrists. Each link seemed to pulse with a faint ghostly light, and Omar could see the intricate runes carved into the smooth surface of the bones. What did you do?" Halim asked, his voice trembling slightly. He was trying to sound brave, but Omar could hear the uncertainty beneath his words. Lilith's expression grew mournful. "I did what I believed was right," she replied. "I sought to bring knowledge and freedom to those who were kept in ignorance and chains. But those in power feared what I could offer, and so they twisted the truth to paint me as a monster." Omar tightened his grip on Halim's arm, a feeling of dread settling in his gut. "We should leave," he said firmly, his voice barely steady. "This is not our concern." "Baba, wait," Yousef interrupted, his gaze still fixed on the tree's glowing fruit. What if she's telling the truth?" "She's lying," Omar insisted, his voice shaking. He could feel the woman's eyes on him, and it took every ounce of his will to tear his gaze away from her. He turned to his sons, desperation seeping into his voice. "We must leave this place, now." But Halim was not listening. His eyes were fixed on Lilith, his youthful curiosity overriding his father's warnings. "You said you could grant us what we desire," Halim said cautiously. "What does that mean?" Lilith's lips curled into a faint smile. "The chains that bind me were forged by those who sought to keep my gifts from the world," she explained, her voice gentle and enticing. "But if you were to release me, I could share those gifts with you. Wealth, knowledge, even the power to defy death itself." Omar's breath caught in his throat, and he saw the way his son's eyes widened at her words. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but no words came. His tongue felt heavy, and his thoughts were muddled by the woman's voice, which seemed to weave its way into his mind like a silken thread. "Treasure," Lilith continued, her gaze resting on Halim. "Gold and jewels beyond your wildest dreams, enough to build kingdoms and buy anything your heart desires. All you need to do is help me break these chains." Halim's eyes gleamed with excitement, and Omar felt his grip on his son's arm loosen. He wanted to pull Halim away, to drag him out of this cursed cavern, but he could see the eagerness in his son's eyes. The hope of escaping a life of hardship and finding something greater. "No," Omar muttered, shaking his head as if trying to clear away the fog in his mind. "This is wrong." Lilith's gaze shifted to Yousef, and her smile became softer, almost tender. "And you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You seek knowledge, do you not? To understand the mysteries of this world and the next. The fruit of this tree holds the wisdom of ages, the secrets of gods and kings. All you need to do is pluck it." Yousef's eyes widened, and Omar saw the hunger in his son's gaze. The desire to prove himself, to gain power and understanding beyond the limits of mortal men. Omar's heart ached as he watched his eldest son take a hesitant step toward the tree. "Yousef, no," Omar pleaded, his voice breaking. "This is not the way." Lilith's gaze finally turned to Omar, and he felt a chill run through him as her dark eyes seemed to pierce through his very soul. "And you, Omar," she said softly, her voice laced with sadness. "I know your pain. I know what you have lost. and what you have longed for all these years." Omar's breath caught in his throat, and he felt a wave of grief crash over him, memories of his lost daughter flooding his mind. He had tried to bury the pain, to move on for the sake of his sons, but the wound had never truly healed. It had festered in the darkness of his heart, a wound that time could not mend. "I can bring her back," Lilith whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can reunite you with your daughter. All you need to do is trust me." Omar felt his knees grow weak, and he sank to the ground, his hands trembling. His sons were watching him, waiting for him to make a choice, to decide their fate. He could see the longing in their eyes, the hope that maybe, just maybe, Lilith was telling the truth. But deep down, in the depths of his soul, Omar knew that her words were laced with poison. "We should leave," Omar said again, his voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at Halim, then at Yousef, pleading silently for them to listen. But his son's eyes were still fixed on Lilith, their minds clouded by the promises she had whispered. And in the shadows of the cavern, the ancient chains made from the bones of angels seemed to shiver, as if sensing the weakening resolve of those who stood before them. The cavern seemed to breathe with the soft rustling of the glowing leaves, the faint echoes of an unseen breeze whispering through the air. Omar's mind raced, trying to think of a way to pull his sons away from this place and away from the influence of the woman who called herself Lilith. But her words had sunk their hooks into Halim and Yusuf, and Omar could see the conflict waging behind their eyes. "We should leave," Omar said, trying to keep his voice steady. He could hear the desperation creeping in, his tone betraying his fear. "Baba," Halim whispered, his voice barely audible. "What if she's telling the truth?" "There is no truth in dark places," Omar replied sharply. But his words seemed to fall flat in the stillness of the cavern. Lilith watched them in silence, her dark eyes glimmering with an unreadable intensity. She had spoken of promises, of wealth and knowledge, and even the power to defy death itself. The weight of those promises hung heavy in the air, tangible and thick with temptation. Halim's eyes darted between his father and Lilith. The idea of unimaginable wealth, of gold and treasures hidden away in secret places, had taken root in his mind. Halim had always been the dreamer, always looking beyond their humble lives for something more. The thought of riches was like a flame flickering in the dark, drawing him closer despite his father's warnings. "Baba, we live in hardship every day," Halim said, his voice trembling with both fear and excitement. "What if this is our chance to change that?" Omar turned to face his youngest son, seeing the longing in his eyes, the desire to break free from the chains of poverty that had bound them for so long. It was a longing that Omar understood all too well, having struggled to provide for his family since the day he became a father. But he knew that nothing in this world came without a cost, especially not promises made by voices in the dark. "Halim," Omar said softly, reaching out to place a hand on his son's shoulder, "there is no treasure worth trading your soul for." Lilith's voice, gentle and melodic, broke the silence that followed. "You do not have to believe me," she said, her gaze resting on Halim, "but I can show you the truth if you are willing to see it." Halim hesitated, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Omar tightened his grip on his son's shoulder, but Halim took a step forward, shrugging off his father's hand. "Halim, no," Omar warned, his voice low and urgent. But Halim had already made up his mind. He took another step closer to Lilith, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something magnetic about her presence, something that drew him in despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. "Show me," Halim whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Lilith's smile was soft, almost tender, as she inclined her head. "Come closer," she said, her voice as sweet as honey. Omar moved to pull Halim back, but Lilith's dark eyes met his, and he felt a sudden pressure in his chest, as if the air had thickened around him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was frozen in place, his hand outstretched toward his son, but unable to close the distance. Halim stepped closer, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Lilith raised her hand, and the chains binding her wrist clinked softly, their runes glowing faintly in the bluish light. She held her hand out to Halim, her fingers slender and pale, as if inviting him to take it. "Close your eyes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Halim obeyed, his heart pounding as he reached out to take her hand. The moment their fingers touched, he felt a rush of warmth spread through his body, like the glow of a fire on a cold night. His mind seemed to drift, and in the darkness behind his closed eyelids, he saw visions. Glimpses of gold and jewels, hidden in secret places beneath the earth. He saw great halls filled with treasure, mountains of coins and precious stones, enough to make a man a king. Omar watched in horror, unable to move, as his son's face lit up with wonder. He knew, deep down, that these visions were illusions, lies crafted to lure his son into Lilith's grasp. But Halim seemed enraptured, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the visions danced behind his eyes. "Do you see?" Lilith's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the stillness of the cavern. "Do you see the treasures that await you, if only you free me from these chains?" Halim nodded, his eyes still closed, and Omar felt his heart break at the sight. His son was slipping away, drawn into the darkness by promises of wealth and grandeur. "Open your eyes," Lilith said softly. Halim's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a gasp, his hands trembling. The visions faded, replaced by the eerie blue glow of the cavern. But the memory of what he had seen lingered, filling him with a desperate longing. I saw it," Halim breathed, his voice shaking with excitement. "It was real." Omar's paralysis broke, and he rushed forward, grabbing his son by the shoulders. "Halim, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice thick with desperation. "Whatever you saw, it was not real. It was a trick, a lie." Halim shook his head, his eyes wild with hope. "No, Baba, it was real. I saw it with my own eyes." Lilith's gaze remained fixed on Halim, her expression patient and serene, as if waiting for him to make his choice. "The treasure is real," she said softly, "but it is hidden, beyond the reach of those who would keep me imprisoned here. Only you have the power to free me, and to claim what is yours by right." Omar's grip tightened on Halim's shoulders, his knuckles white with tension. "We are leaving," he said firmly, trying to pull his son away. But Halim resisted, his eyes filled with a stubborn determination that Omar had seen many times before. "No," Halim insisted, his voice steady. "This is our chance, Baba. We can finally have a life free of hardship." "It is a lie," Omar said desperately, his voice breaking. "Please, Halim, listen to me." "I'm tired of listening to you," Halim shouted, his voice echoing in the cavern. His words struck Omar like a physical blow, and he felt the sting of betrayal deep in his chest. Halim wrenched himself free from his father's grip, taking a step closer to Lilith. Omar watched, helpless, as his youngest son reached out toward the chains that bound the ancient woman. "Stop," Omar whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, Halim." "Stop." But Halim did not stop. He reached for the chains, his fingers brushing against the smooth, ivory-white surface of the bones. The runes carved into the chains seemed to pulse with a faint light, as if responding to his touch. Before Omar could move to stop him, a hand grabbed his arm. He turned to see Yousef, his eldest son, watching him with a look of resignation and sorrow. "Baba," Yousef said softly, his voice heavy with a mixture of guilt and understanding. "We have to let him make his own choice." Omar stared at his eldest son in disbelief, his mind reeling with the realization that he was losing both of them. He felt his strength falter, his resolve crumbling under the weight of his son's defiance. Lilith's smile deepened, and Omar knew that she had already won. The bluish light from the tree cast long, flickering shadows across the cavern floor, and the ancient whispers that seemed to echo from the roots filled the air with an almost hypnotic hum. Omar stood in silence, watching as Halim slowly pulled his hand back from the chains, his expression dazed and wonderstruck. The spell that Lilith had woven around his youngest son was like a veil that shrouded reality, leaving only her promises lingering in his mind. "Baba," Halim whispered, almost in awe. "I felt it. The power. The wealth. It's real." Omar's heart sank. His words seemed useless, drowned out by the allure of the visions Lilith had planted in Halim's mind. He turned to Yousef, his eldest, hoping for support. Yousef's face was pale, his brow furrowed in deep thought, but there was a flicker in his eyes. A flicker of doubt and something else. Curiosity. "What about you, Yousef?" Lilith's voice broke the silence, gentle and melodic. It was almost as if she had sensed the growing uncertainty within him. "I can see the questions in your eyes, the hunger for knowledge, for understanding." Yousef's gaze shifted from Halim to Lilith, his jaw clenched as he tried to resist the pull of her words. "What do you know of knowledge?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. Lilith's smile was patient and knowing, like that of a teacher addressing a hesitant student. "I know that there is more to this world than what is visible to the eye," she replied. "I know of secrets hidden beneath the surface of things, and of truths long buried by those who seek to control the fate of mankind." Omar felt a chill run down his spine as he watched Yousef's expression shift, the hardness in his eyes giving way to a flicker of curiosity. He knew that Yousef had always been driven by a desire to prove himself, to be more than just a simple shepherd's son. Knowledge was a hunger that had gnawed at him for as long as Omar could remember, and it was a hunger that Lilith was all too eager to feed. "Yousef," Omar said softly, his voice pleading, "do not listen to her. There are some things in this world that are meant to remain unknown." But Yousef's eyes were locked on Lilith, his curiosity waging war against his father's warnings. "What do you mean by truths long buried?" he asked, his voice low. Lilith inclined her head, her dark eyes reflecting the soft blue light of the cavern. "There is a power within this tree," she said, her voice almost reverent. "A power that those who imprisoned me feared above all else. It is the power of knowledge. The power to see beyond the limits of mortality and grasp the mysteries of existence." Yousef's eyes darted to the fruit that hung from the tree's branches, each orb glowing faintly with an ethereal light. The fruit seemed to pulse in time with the soft rustling of the leaves, as if calling out to him, inviting him to taste its forbidden sweetness. "Baba," Yousef murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "what if this is our chance to understand? To see the world as it truly is?" Omar's heart pounded in his chest, and he took a step closer to his eldest son, desperation etched into every line of his face. "Some knowledge is not meant for us, Yousef," he said urgently. "It is not meant for any moral man. This is a test, a temptation that you must resist." But Yousef's eyes remained fixed on the fruit, the allure of its glowing light drawing him in like a moth to a flame. Omar could see the struggle in his son's eyes, the conflict between the teachings of his father and the burning desire to break free from the limitations of their simple lives. "Do you know what this fruit is?" Lilith asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. "It is the fruit of the forbidden tree, the very same tree that once stood in the garden of creation. Those who eat of it gain wisdom beyond measure, the knowledge of gods." Omar felt his blood run cold at her words. The forbidden tree. He had heard stories of it in the ancient scriptures, tales of a garden lost to time and of a temptation that had led to the downfall of mankind. It was a tale meant to teach humility and obedience, a tale of the consequences of seeking power beyond what was given. But for Yousef, it was not a warning. It was a challenge. "Yousef," Omar said desperately, reaching out to grab his son's arm, "please, do not listen to her. This is not the way." But Yousef shook off his father's hand, his eyes filled with determination. "No, Baba," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "All my life, I have been told to obey, to accept things as they are. But what if we have been blind? What if there is more to this world than what we have been taught?" Omar's heart ached as he listened to his son's words, each one like a knife twisting in his chest. He had raised Yousef to be strong, to question the world around him, but now that very strength was leading him down a dangerous path, a path that Omar feared would lead to ruin. "Your father speaks out of fear," Lilith said softly, her voice almost soothing, "but fear is the enemy of knowledge. You have the chance to see beyond that fear, to grasp the wisdom that was denied to those who came before you." Yousef took a step closer to the tree, his gaze fixed on the fruit. Omar moved to stop him, but his feet felt like lead, his movements sluggish and heavy. He watched helplessly as Yousef reached up, his hand trembling as he approached the nearest branch. "Stop," Omar pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please, Yousef, do not do this." But Yousef's eyes were filled with resolve. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cool surface of the fruit. A shiver ran through him, and for a moment he hesitated, his hand hovering just inches from the fruit's stem. Omar felt his breath catch in his throat, a desperate prayer forming in his mind. He pleaded silently for Yousef to turn away, to abandon this path before it was too late. But Lilith's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Do you want to be more than what you are?" she whispered. "Do you want to see the world as it truly is, and not as others would have you see it?" Yousef's hand tightened around the fruit's stem, and Omar felt a wave of dread crash over him. He could see the hesitation in his son's eyes, the doubt, the fear, the longing for something greater. But Lilith's words had planted a seed, and that seed was beginning to take root. "Yousef," Omar whispered, his voice barely audible, "please." But Yousef did not turn back. With a final, determined breath, he pulled the fruit from the branch. The moment the fruit left the tree, the cavern seemed to shudder, the light from the leaves flickering and dimming. Omar felt a chill in the air, a sense of foreboding that seeped into his bones. Yousef held the fruit in his hand, staring down at it with a mixture of awe and terror. It was heavier than he had expected, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. He could feel a strange energy pulsing beneath his fingers, as if the fruit held within it the weight of ages. "What have you done?" Omar whispered, his voice trembling. Yousef turned to face his father, his expression defiant yet uncertain. "I have chosen," he replied, his voice steady. And in the shadows of the cavern, Lilith smiled, a smile of triumph and anticipation. The cavern seemed to hold its breath in the wake of Yousef's choice. The bluish light from the tree's leaves dimmed, casting long, wavering shadows across the stone walls. Omar's heart felt heavy, each beat echoing the finality of what had just happened. He stood there, watching his eldest son, the fruit of the forbidden tree clutched tightly in Yousef's hand, and felt a profound sense of helplessness wash over him. "Yousef," Omar whispered, his voice thick with desperation, "you don't understand what you've done." Yousef's eyes met his father's, defiance and doubt warring within their depths. "I have done what I believe is right," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. He glanced down at the fruit, feeling its weight, the smoothness of its skin beneath his fingers. It was cool to the touch, and yet there was a warmth beneath that surface, a strange pulse that seemed to resonate with his very soul. Omar felt a chill run down his spine as he saw the conviction in Yousef's eyes. His son's desire to break free from the limits of his life, to find something greater, something that would set him apart, had led him down this dark path. Omar had tried to guide him, to teach him to be cautious and humble, but now those teachings seemed like nothing more than distant echoes, drowned out by the promise of forbidden knowledge. "Halim," Omar called softly, turning to his youngest son, hoping to find an ally. "You must see reason." This woman is using us. She is using you both." Halim's expression was conflicted, his eyes darting between his father and his brother. He had been drawn in by Lilith's promises of wealth and grandeur, but now that the moment had arrived, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Halim was young, eager for adventure and change, but he was not blind to his father's fear. "Baba," Halim said hesitantly, "what if Yousef is right? What if she really can give us what we want?" Omar felt his chest tighten at his son's words. He could see the uncertainty in Halim's eyes, the hope mingling with fear. It was a hope that had been kindled by Lilith's whispers, her promises of a life beyond their meager existence. But Omar knew. He knew that such promises always came with a terrible cost. Before he could respond, Lilith's voice broke the silence, gentle and soothing. "I understand your fear, Omar," she said, her gaze resting on him with a semblance of sympathy. "You have carried the burden of loss and hardship for so long. You have known pain and sorrow, and you do not want your sons to suffer the same fate." Omar felt a shudder run through him as Lilith's words seemed to reach into the deepest parts of his soul. She spoke of his fears, his regrets, his hidden grief, things that he had tried to bury beneath a facade of strength and resolve. And as she spoke, the memories of his lost daughter came rushing back, a wave of pain that nearly brought him to his knees. "I can give you peace," Lilith continued, her voice a soft murmur. "I can give you the one thing you have longed for all these years, the chance to see your daughter again." Omar's breath caught in his throat, and he felt his vision blur with unshed tears. His daughter, his precious child, taken from him by a senseless conflict. He had never been able to save her, never been able to hold her in his arms one last time. The pain of that loss had become a constant companion, a shadow that followed him wherever he went. But now, Lilith's words offered him something he had never thought possible. The chance to undo the past, to bring his daughter back from the darkness that had claimed her. "You are lying," Omar said, his voice trembling. He wanted to believe that she was lying, that her words were nothing more than cruel deceptions. But deep down, a part of him, the part that was still a grieving father, longed to believe in the impossible. Lilith's expression remained serene, her voice filled with a sadness that mirrored his own. "I have no reason to lie," she said softly. "I only seek my freedom, and in return, I offer you the gift of reunion." Omar's hands trembled as he tried to hold on to his resolve. He turned to his sons, hoping to see doubt in their eyes, hoping that they would sense the danger that he could feel in every breath. But Yousef's gaze remained steady, his grip on the fruit unyielding, and Halim's eyes were filled with a longing that Omar recognized all too well. A longing for something beyond the life they had known, a life that had been filled with struggle and sacrifice. "Do you not wish to see her again, Omar?" Lilith whispered, her voice like a caress. "Do you not wish to undo the pain that has haunted you for so long?" Omar felt his knees give way, and he sank to the ground, his head bowed in despair. He wanted to resist, to hold on to the teachings of his faith, the warnings of ancient tales. But those teachings felt so distant now, like whispers carried away by the wind. All that remained was the weight of his grief, and the hope, however fleeting, that he could be reunited with his lost daughter. "Baba," Yousef said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of defiance and pleading, "you taught us to seek the truth, to question what we have been told. How can we turn away from this chance?" Omar looked up at his son, his vision blurred by tears. "This is not truth," he said, his voice breaking. "This is a lie, a temptation meant to lead us to ruin." But Yousef's expression remained resolute, and Omar knew that his words had fallen on deaf ears. His son was no longer a child who could be guided by his father's hand. He was a man who had made his own choice, and that choice had led him to the edge of a precipice. Omar turned to Halim, hoping for a final chance to save his youngest son. Halim, he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, do not listen to her. You must trust me. Halim's eyes were filled with uncertainty, his mind torn between the promises of wealth and the warnings of his father. He glanced at Yousef, then at Lilith, and finally back at Omar. He wanted to believe his father, but the allure of the unknown, of a life beyond their struggles, was too powerful to ignore. Before Omar could speak again, Lilith's voice broke to silence. Your father is afraid, she said gently, her gaze resting on Halim with a semblance of understanding. But fear is the enemy of progress, of change. You have the power to shape your own destiny, to break free from the chains of your past. Omar felt his heart shatter as he watched the conflict in Halim's eyes. He could see the longing, the hope, the desire to find something greater than what they had known. And he knew, deep down in the depths of his soul, that he was losing both of his sons to Lilith's seductive whispers. Baba, Halim said softly, his voice filled with sorrow. Maybe this is the only way. Omar felt a sob rise in his throat, and he shook his head, his voice breaking as he pleaded with his sons. Please, do not do this. Do not leave me. But his words were met with silence, and the echoes of that silence seemed to stretch on forever, filling the cavern with a sense of inevitability. In the shadows of the cavern, the ancient chains made from the bones of angels shivered, as if sensing the final threads of resistance slipping away. Omar stood in the middle of the cavern, his heart heavy with the realization that he was losing his sons. The bluish light from the tree flickered as if in anticipation, the ancient leaves rustling softly as if whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. Yousef held the forbidden fruit in his hand, his grip firm, while Halim lingered close to the ancient chains, his eyes filled with a dangerous mixture of curiosity and defiance. Lilith remained silent, her eyes watching the unfolding tension between father and sons with an almost serene patience. Her presence loomed over them like a shadow, her silence allowing the seeds of rebellion she had sown to take root and grow. Halim, Omar said, his voice a whisper heavy with fear and desperation. Yousef, please, we must leave this place. Whatever she has promised is not worth the cost. But his son's eyes did not waver. Yousef's gaze remained steady, his jaw clenched with a resolve that Omar recognized all too well. It was the same resolve that had driven him to teach his sons to stand firm in the face of hardship, to question the world around them, and to seek their own paths. But now, that resolve had been turned against him, twisted by Lilith's seductive whispers. We are not children anymore, Baba, Yousef replied, his voice steady but cold. You taught us to seek knowledge, to question what we are told. How can you ask us to turn away from this? From the chance to grasp something greater? Omar's hands trembled as he struggled to find the right words. I taught you to seek the truth, he said, his voice breaking. But not all truths are meant for us. Some paths lead only to ruin. Lilith's voice, gentle and soothing, broke the tense silence. Your father speaks out of fear, she said softly, her dark eyes resting on Yousef and Halim. But fear is a cage, and those who live within it are prisoners of their own making. Halim's eyes darted to Lilith, and Omar could see the struggle in his youngest son's expression. The conflict between the loyalty he felt to his father and the allure of the promises Lilith had whispered. Halim had always been the dreamer, eager for adventure and change, and now he was standing on the edge of a choice that would shape his fate. Halim, Omar pleaded, his voice trembling, you must trust me. This woman, she is using you. She is using both of you. But Halim's gaze hardened, and Omar felt a pang of sorrow as he saw the determination in his son's eyes. It was a determination fueled by years of hardship, of living a life bound by the limitations of their meager existence. Halim wanted more. He wanted a future that was not defined by the struggles of the past. You've always held me back, Baba, Halim said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and frustration. You never let me make my own choices. You never believed that I could find my own path." Omar felt his heart break at his son's words. He had tried to protect his sons from the dangers of the world, to guide them with the wisdom he had gained from a lifetime of mistakes. But now, those very efforts had become a chain that bound them to the life he had tried so hard to protect them from. "I only wanted to keep you safe," Omar whispered, his voice thick with grief. "To keep you both safe." "You cannot keep us safe forever," Yousef said, his tone cold and unyielding. "We are not children anymore. We have the right to make our own choices, to seek our own paths." Omar felt his strength falter, the weight of his son's words crushing the resolve he had tried so desperately to hold on to. He wanted to argue, to shout, to beg them to listen, but the words caught in his throat, and all that remained was the ache of a father's love and the fear of what was to come. "You do not have to fight each other," Lilith said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "You can choose to break free, to release me from these chains and take hold of the future that awaits you." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words and the weight of choices yet to be made. Halim took a step closer to the chains, his eyes locked on Lilith's, while Yousef remained where he stood, the forbidden fruit still clutched tightly in his hand. Omar felt his pulse quicken, the desperation rising within him like a tide. He took a step forward, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "No," he said firmly, his voice breaking through the silence. "This ends now. We are leaving this place together." Yousef's eyes narrowed, and Omar saw the defiance in his son's gaze. The same defiance that had driven him to seek the fruit of the forbidden tree, to reject his father's teachings in favor of the promises Lilith had whispered. "You have no right to decide our fate, Baba," Yousef said coldly. "We have the right to choose." Omar's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. He could feel the anger building within him, the frustration of watching his sons fall under the spell of a woman who had done nothing but weave lies and deceit. But beneath that anger was something deeper, a fear that he was losing them, that no matter what he did, he could not pull them back from the brink. "You are being deceived," Omar said, his voice rising with desperation. "This woman is not what she seems. She is a creature of darkness, a force that seeks only to destroy." Lilith's expression remained calm, her gaze unwavering as she watched the tension between father and sons reach its breaking point. "Do not be afraid to grasp what is yours by right," she said softly. "You have the power to shape your own destinies." Omar felt something snap within him, a surge of emotion that he could no longer contain. He took a step toward Halim, reaching out to grab his son's arm, but Halim pulled away, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. "Don't touch me," Halim shouted, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You can't control me anymore." Omar's breath caught in his throat, and he felt his vision blur with unshed tears. He had always been the protector, the guide, the one who stood between his sons and the dangers of the world. But now, in this dark cavern, he felt powerless, helpless to stop the forces that had come between them. "Please," Omar whispered, his voice breaking. "Do not do this." But his words were met with silence, and in that silence, the final threads of trust that had bound them as a family seemed to unravel. Halim turned back to Lilith, his eyes filled with a resolve that Omar had never seen before. Yousef took a step forward, his grip on the forbidden fruit tightening as he prepared to take a bite. "No," Omar said, his voice rising in desperation. "Stop this." But the words were drowned out by the echoes of the cavern, and Omar felt a surge of rage and sorrow as he saw his son slipping further away from him. In that moment, the fear that had gripped his heart gave way to a cold, hard resolve. If he could not save them with words, then he would save them with force. Omar lunged forward, his eyes filled with tears, and grabbed Yousef's arm with a strength born of desperation. Yousef struggled, trying to break free. But Omar held on tightly, his grip unyielding. "Let go of me," Yousef shouted, his voice echoing in the cavern. "Not until you listen," Omar shouted back, his voice raw with emotion. "Not until you understand." Halim moved to intervene, his eyes filled with anger, and Omar felt a flash of panic as he realized that he was fighting both of his sons. The cavern seemed to close in around him, the weight of the ancient tree pressing down on his shoulders like a burden too heavy to bear. But Omar could not let go. He could not abandon his sons to the darkness that had taken hold of their hearts. In the struggle, the forbidden fruit slipped from Yousef's grasp and rolled across the stone floor, coming to rest at the base of the tree. Omar tightened his grip, pulling Yousef away from the fruit, but Halim rushed forward, reaching for the ancient chains that bound Lilith. "No!" Omar shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and terror. He released Yousef and turned to stop Halim, his heart pounding with a fear unlike any he had ever known. But in that moment, the weight of years of struggle and sacrifice seemed to fall away, and Omar's vision blurred with a mixture of grief and rage. He saw only the faces of his sons, his precious children, who had been twisted and led astray by the promises of a creature he did not understand. He saw only the choice that lay before him, a choice that would define their fate. With a cry that was part desperation, part agony, Omar lunged forward and struck Halim, his fist connecting with his youngest son's jaw. Halim staggered back, his eyes wide with shock, and Omar felt a pang of guilt stab through him like a knife. But there was no time for guilt. There was only the choice. The terrible choice that he had never wanted to make. "Forgive me," Omar whispered, his voice breaking. And with a heart filled with sorrow, Omar raised his hand once more, preparing to do whatever it took to stop his sons from making the choice that would lead them to ruin. Omar's heart pounded, each beat echoing the heavy silence that had settled over the cavern. The bluish light from the tree seemed to flicker and waver, the shadows shifting restlessly as if anticipating the events about to unfold. Omar's hand trembled as he stood between his two sons, their faces etched with anger and betrayal. Halim, still reeling from the blow his father had dealt, took a shaky step backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He had never seen his father like this, so desperate, so filled with a determination that bordered on madness. The anger in Halim's eyes began to melt into something else, something far more dangerous: resentment. "Why, Baba?" Halim whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, wounded edge. "Why can't you let us choose for ourselves?" Yousef stood a few paces away, his chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. His grip on the forbidden fruit had loosened, but his resolve had not wavered. He watched the confrontation with a grim determination, his face hardened by years of questioning and rebellion. He had always been the stronger of the two, always the one who challenged his father's teachings. And now that defiance had led them all to this moment, Omar felt his throat tighten, the words caught between love and desperation. How could he explain to his sons that every choice they made in this cavern would lead only to darkness? How could he convince them that the woman chained to the tree was not a savior, but a curse, one that threatened to consume them all? Lilith remained silent, her dark eyes watching the unfolding drama with a patience that was both unnerving and terrifying. She had sown the seeds of doubt and rebellion, and now she waited for those seeds to bear fruit. "Halim, Yusuf," Omar said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Please, I beg you, do not let her lies guide your choices." Yusuf's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to his father, his grip tightening around the fruit once more. "And what if she's telling the truth?" Yousef countered, his voice steady and cold. "What if you're the one who's been lying to us all along?" The words struck Omar like a physical blow, and he felt his strength falter. Yousef's accusation cut deep, reopening old wounds and dredging up memories he had tried so hard to bury. He had never lied to his sons, not intentionally, but there were truths he had kept from them, painful truths that he believed were better left unsaid. "Yousef," Omar whispered, his voice barely audible, "I have only ever tried to protect you, to protect both of you." "By keeping us in ignorance?" Yousef retorted, his tone sharp and unyielding. "By denying us the chance to make our own choices?" Omar felt the tears welling in his eyes, and he fought to keep his voice steady. "Not every choice is meant to be made," he replied softly. "Some paths lead only to ruin." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears, and Omar knew that his sons were slipping further away from him, drawn into the web of lies that Lilith had woven. He glanced at Halim, hoping to find some sign of hesitation, but his youngest son's face was a mask of confusion and hurt. Halim turned to Yousef, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Maybe Baba's right," he said softly. "Maybe we shouldn't." "Don't be a fool, Halim," Yousef interrupted, his voice laced with anger and frustration. "We've spent our whole lives being told what to do, what to believe. This is our chance to find the truth for ourselves." Omar watched in helpless silence as his sons argued, the bonds that had once held them together now unraveling in the face of temptation and doubt. He wanted to scream, to shout at them to stop, but the words caught in his throat, leaving only the bitter taste of regret. And then, in a moment of clarity, Omar knew what he had to do. His sons would not listen to reason. They would not turn away from the path they had chosen, and Lilith's promises had already taken root in their hearts. There was only one way to protect them now, one terrible choice that he had never wanted to make. "Forgive me," Omar whispered, his voice breaking. With a swift, desperate motion, Omar lunged forward, grabbing Yousef by the arm. Yousef struggled, his eyes wide with shock, but Omar's grip was unyielding. The forbidden fruit slipped from Yousef's grasp and fell to the ground, rolling away into the shadows. "What are you doing?" Yousef shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and fury. But Omar did not answer. His mind was a whirlwind of grief and determination, a father's love twisted into something fierce and desperate. He could feel the weight of his sons' lives pressing down on him, and he knew that there was no turning back. Before Yousef could break free, Omar reached for the dagger he kept at his side. A relic of his past, a weapon he had sworn never to use again. The blade glinted faintly in the bluish light as Omar raised it, his hands trembling. "Baba, no!" Halim cried, his voice breaking with terror. But Omar's heart was already breaking, and the only thing that kept him moving was the knowledge that this was the only way to save them. The only way to protect them from the darkness that threatened to consume them all. "I'm sorry," Omar whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." In one swift motion, Omar plunged the dagger into Yousef's chest. His son's eyes widened in shock, and a gasp escaped his lips as the blade pierced his flesh. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the cavern echoing with the sound of Yousef's ragged breaths. Omar felt the tears streaming down his face, his vision blurred by grief. He had never wanted this. Never wanted to hurt his sons. But he knew that if he did not act, he would lose them both to the darkness. Yousef's knees buckled, and Omar caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. His son's eyes met his, and Omar saw the pain and confusion reflected in their depths. He wanted to speak, to explain, but the words would not come. "Why?" Yousef whispered, his voice barely audible. Omar choked back a sob, his heart shattering beneath the weight of what he had done. "Because I love you," he replied, his voice trembling. "Because I could not let you go." Before Halim could react, Omar turned to face him, his dagger still stained with blood. Halim took a step back, his eyes wide with horror, and Omar felt his resolve waver. But there was no time for hesitation. There was only the choice. The terrible choice that had led him to this moment. "Baba, please," Halim pleaded, his voice trembling with fear. "Don't." Omar moved swiftly, his heart heavy with sorrow, and struck Halim down with a single swift motion. His youngest son's eyes filled with pain and betrayal, and Omar felt a part of himself die in that moment, a part that he knew would never return. The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of it pressing down on Omar's chest like a stone. He fell to his knees, the dagger slipping from his grasp, and wept. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice broken and raw. "I'm so sorry." But his words were met with silence, and in that silence, the ancient runes carved into the tree's roots began to fade, the blood of his sons seeping into the earth. Omar felt the ground tremble beneath him, the cavern shaking as the ancient chains that bound Lilith shuddered and loosened. He looked up, his vision blurred by tears, and saw Lilith standing before him, her chains falling away like dust. She smiled, a smile that was both beautiful and terrible, a smile that held the promise of ruin. "Thank you, Omar," Lilith said softly, her voice filled with triumph. "Your sacrifice has set me free." Omar felt the last remnants of his strength leave him, his body trembling with the weight of his grief. He had tried to protect his sons, tried to keep them from making the same mistakes he had made, but in the end, he had only brought about the very fate he had sought to prevent. As the last of the chains fell away, a deep, resonant sound echoed through the cavern. The sound of sky trumpets, distant and mournful, seeming to come from above. It was a sound that defied explanation, reverberating through the stone walls and filling the cavern with a sense of impending doom. Lilith took a step forward, her form shifting and changing, her beauty giving way to something dark and terrible. She turned to face the entrance of the cavern, her eyes gleaming with the promise of vengeance. Omar watched in silence, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a crushing tide. He had tried to save his sons, tried to protect them from the darkness, but in the end, he had only unleashed it. The sky trumpets continued to sound, their mournful echoes filling the cavern, and Omar knew that the world would never be the same. The cavern was filled with a haunting silence after the last echoes of the sky trumpets faded into the dark corners. Omar remained on his knees, his body trembling from the weight of what he had done. His sons lay still on the cold stone, their blood seeping into the earth and staining the ancient roots of the forbidden tree. The bluish glow from the leaves flickered weakly, as if mourning the lives that had been lost in this place of shadows. Omar could barely bring himself to lift his head, the grief and regret crashing over him like waves in a storm. He had thought he could save them, thought he could protect his sons from making the same mistakes he had made. But now, as he knelt in the dark, he felt only the hollow ache of failure. Lilith stood before the ancient tree, her form illuminated by the fading light. Her chains, once etched with runes of power, now lay shattered at her feet, the ancient bindings dissolving into dust. The weight of those chains had been a constant burden, a reminder of her imprisonment and the betrayal of those who had feared her. Now, that burden had been lifted, and with it, her true power began to awaken. The runes carved into the roots of the tree continued to fade, their light dimming as the blood of Omar's sons seeped deeper into the ancient wood. Omar could hear the faint rustling of the tree's leaves, a sound that seemed almost like a sigh. An ancient breath exhaled after centuries of stillness. "It is done," Lilith whispered, her voice a soft murmur that seemed to echo through the cavern. "The chains that bound me have been broken, and the world will now bear witness to its reckoning." Omar felt a chill run down his spine, and he forced himself to look up at her. Lilith's appearance had changed. The delicate beauty that had once masked her true nature had given way to something far more terrifying. Her eyes, once dark and haunting, now seemed to shimmer with an inner fire, a light that held the promise of ruin. "What have I done?" Omar choked out, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lilith's smile was almost gentle, but there was no kindness in it, only cold satisfaction. "You have played your part, Omar," she replied. "You have fulfilled your purpose, just as your sons did." Omar felt his heart shatter anew at her words, and he lowered his head, unable to bear the sight of her triumph. His hands trembled as he pressed them to the cold stone, his fingers stained with blood. He had thought he could save his family, but in the end, he had only delivered them into the hands of a darkness he could not understand. "You used us," Omar whispered, his voice trembling with anger and grief. "You lied to us. You used my sons." Lilith's expression remained unchanged, her eyes fixed on the ancient tree. "I did not lie," she said softly. "I offered them what they desired, and they made their choices willingly. It was their blood that set me free." Omar's breath caught in his throat, and he felt a surge of rage rise within him, a father's fury born of love and loss. But that fury was powerless against the ancient force that now stood before him. He had tried to fight, to protect his family, but he had been nothing more than a pawn in a game far older and far darker than he had ever imagined. "Do you hear it, Omar?" Lilith asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The sound of the world beginning to change?" Omar frowned, straining to listen, and he heard it. A faint, distant sound that seemed to echo through the cavern. It was the sound of the sky trumpets, a deep, mournful tone that reverberated through the stone walls, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. The sound seemed to come from above, despite the fact that they were deep within the earth, as if the very heavens were heralding the arrival of something terrible. "What is happening?" Omar asked, his voice trembling with fear. Lilith's gaze shifted, and she turned to face the entrance of the cavern. The faint bluish light from the tree was now mingled with a strange, shifting darkness that seemed to seep in from the edges of the cavern, coiling around the roots like tendrils of shadow. "The beginning," she replied, her voice filled with a terrible certainty. "The beginning of the end." Omar felt his breath catch in his throat, and he struggled to rise to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He could feel the weight of the cavern pressing down on him, the air heavy with the scent of blood and ancient power. He knew that he had unleashed something far greater than he had ever imagined, something that could not be stopped. "Why?" Omar asked, his voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Lilith's gaze softened for a moment, and Omar saw something in her eyes, something that almost resembled sorrow. "Because it is my fate," she replied, her voice heavy with ancient grief. "I was cast out, betrayed by those who feared my power. And now the world must pay the price for their sins." Omar felt a shiver run down his spine, and he knew that there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. He had tried to protect his family, tried to do what was right, but in the end, he had only brought about their doom. "Is this the end?" Omar asked, his voice trembling. Lilith's expression remained unreadable, her eyes reflecting the faint light of the cavern. "It is the end of one world," she replied, "and the beginning of another." Omar felt the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud, and he knew that he was powerless to change what was about to happen. The ancient runes carved into the tree's roots had faded completely, their light extinguished by the blood of his sons. The forbidden tree no longer held the power to bind Lilith, and the chains that had once kept her imprisoned were nothing more than dust. Lilith turned to face the entrance of the cavern, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. The sound of the sky trumpets grew louder, their mournful tone filling the cavern with a sense of finality. Omar could feel the vibrations in the stone beneath him, and he knew that the world above was beginning to tremble. "It is time," Lilith said softly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the trumpets. "Time for the world to bear witness to the consequences of its sins." Omar felt his strength leave him, his body trembling with exhaustion and grief. He had fought so hard to protect his family, but in the end, he had failed them. He had been nothing more than a pawn in Lilith's plan, a means to an end. As the sound of the sky trumpets reached its peak, The entrance of the cavern seemed to split open, revealing a glimpse of the world beyond. Omar could see the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the sky tinged with an unnatural darkness that seemed to pulse with an ancient power. He could hear the distant rumble of thunder, the wind howling like a chorus of mourning voices. Lilith took a step forward, her form shifting and changing, her beauty giving way to something dark and terrible. She turned to face Omar one last time, her eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. "Thank you, Omar," she said softly, "for giving me my freedom." Omar felt a tear slip down his cheek, and he closed his eyes, his heart heavy with regret. He had tried to save his family, but in the end, he had only delivered them into the hands of a darkness he could not understand. The sound of the sky trumpets continued to echo through the cavern, their mournful tone filling the air with a sense of finality. Omar knew that the world would never be the same. The cavern was silent, save for the mournful echoes of the sky trumpets that still resonated within its walls. Omar remained on his knees, his strength all but gone, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a crushing tide. He felt the chill of the air seep into his bones, and the dim blue light from the tree faded, casting the cavern into a deeper shadow. Lilith stood at the cavern's entrance, her eyes fixed on the world beyond. Her chains were gone, their remnants scattered like dust at her feet. The ancient runes that had once held her captive had been extinguished by the blood of Omar's sons, and now there was nothing left to bind her. She took a slow, deliberate breath, and the darkness seemed to pulse in response, as if the very air was alive with anticipation. Omar looked up at her, his vision blurred by tears and exhaustion. What will you do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lilith did not turn to face him. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where dark clouds gathered like a living shroud. "What I was always meant to do," she replied softly, "to bring balance to a world that has forgotten its place." Omar felt a shiver run down his spine, and he knew that there was no stopping what was about to unfold. He had played his part in Lilith's release, and now the world would bear the consequences. He could hear the wind howling beyond the cavern, its mournful cry mingling with the distant sound of the sky trumpets. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the dawn of something new and terrible. As Lilith stepped forward, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shudder, the very stones vibrating with an ancient power. She moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, her form shifting subtly as the shadows coiled around her like serpents. Omar could feel the air grow heavier with each step she took, and the bluish light from the tree flickered one last time before fading completely. When she reached the entrance of the cavern, the darkness outside seemed to part before her, as if even the shadows feared her approach. Omar's heart pounded in his chest, and he forced himself to rise, his legs trembling beneath him. He could not let her leave, not without understanding what he had set in motion. "Lilith," he called, his voice barely audible. Lilith paused, her back still turned to him. For a moment, there was only silence, the weight of unspoken words lingering between them, and then, without looking back, she spoke. "You have given me my freedom, Omar," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange, almost gentle melody. "But freedom is not without its price, and now the world must pay that price." Omar felt a tear slip down his cheek, and he lowered his head in defeat. There was nothing more he could do, nothing more he could say to change the course of what was to come. He had failed his sons, and he had failed the world. Lilith stepped out of the cavern, and as she did, the sky seemed to split open, the dark clouds parting to reveal a sight that took Omar's breath away. Waiting beyond the entrance, on the rocky cliffs that surrounded the cavern, were figures of radiant light. Figures clad in armor of gold and silver, their wings outstretched like shields against the encroaching darkness. Angels. Omar's eyes widened in awe and fear as he beheld the host of celestial warriors, their presence radiating a light so pure that it seemed to drive back the shadows. They stood in formation, their faces grim and resolute, their expressions etched with determination and sorrow. Each angel bore a weapon, gleaming swords and long gilded spears that glimmered in the dim light. The angels were beautiful and terrible, their wings shimmering with an ethereal glow, their armor reflecting the faint light of the storm-laden sky. They were an army of the divine, prepared for a battle that had been foretold in the oldest of scriptures, a battle that would decide the fate of the world. One angel, taller and more imposing than the rest, stepped forward. His wings were adorned with feathers of silver and gold, and his eyes shone with a light that seemed to pierce the very soul. He carried a spear in one hand, its tip gleaming with an unearthly fire, and in his other hand he held a shield engraved with ancient runes of power. "Lilith," the angel called, his voice deep and resonant. "You were bound by the will of the Maker, and you were meant to remain in chains until the end of days. But you have been freed by mortal hands, and now you must face the judgment that awaits you." Lilith turned to face the angels, her expression unreadable. The shadows around her seemed to ripple and shift, as if in response to the celestial light. She regarded the host of warriors with a calm, almost serene gaze, her eyes glimmering with an ancient and terrible understanding. "Judgment?" Lilith repeated, her voice carrying a note of amusement. "You speak of judgment, and yet you stand here with your weapons drawn, ready to spill blood in the name of your Maker." The lead angel's grip tightened on his spear, and the air seemed to hum with tension. "We do not seek to spill blood," he replied firmly. "We seek to protect what remains of the world from your wrath." Lilith's smile deepened, and there was something almost pitying in her gaze. "You misunderstand, as you always have," she said softly. "You and your Maker believe that I am the enemy, that I am the source of the world's suffering. But you are wrong." The angels remained silent, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Omar watched in silence, his heart pounding with fear and awe. He could feel the weight of something ancient and profound pressing down on him, a weight that seemed to transcend the boundaries of time and space. Lilith took a step forward, and the shadows around her seemed to coil like serpents, their movements fluid and sinuous. The angels tightened their formation, their wings outstretched, their weapons raised in preparation for the battle that was about to begin. But Lilith did not move to strike. Instead, she looked up at the darkened sky, her expression serene, and spoke. "Is this all you are willing to sacrifice, Maker?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Is this all that you will offer in defense of a world that you have abandoned?" The angel's expressions hardened, and Omar felt a shiver run down his spine. He did not understand the full meaning of Lilith's words, but he could feel the weight of them, the terrible truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of her question. The lead angel took a step forward, his wings outstretched, his spear raised. "We will not allow you to bring ruin upon this world," he declared, his voice filled with unwavering conviction. Lilith's smile widened, and there was something in her eyes, something dark and terrible, something that spoke of ages long past and secrets that had been buried beneath layers of time. She spread her arms, and the shadows around her seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "Then let us see," Lilith replied, her voice carrying a note of anticipation. "Let us see what the Maker is willing to sacrifice to stop me." The silence that followed was heavy with the promise of violence, the air thick with tension. Omar could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and he knew that whatever was about to happen would shape the fate of the world. And as the angels tightened their grip on their weapons, the storm clouds overhead began to shift, the wind howling like a chorus of mourning voices. The dawn of darkness had arrived,